Good morning. Today we are going to be discussing slavery, the Civil War era, and a few important people from that time, which include Julia Ho, who wrote the Battle Hymn Republic, James Bennett, who created the New York Herald newspaper, and Samuel Morse, who created Morse code, and also Frederick Douglass, who was an abolitionist activist of that time, and we will also be discussing the Gettysburg Address.
And we'll be discussing the most powerful and influential media partnership in the Reconstruction era, Thomas Nast and Harper's Weekly, and how they changed American history. The main medium used to communicate information to the masses during the Civil War was newspapers. Newspapers from the North, South, and also black populations surfaced, making their opinions on the war heard. The New York Times was founded by Henry Jarvis Raymond in 1851 and had a Republican stance which was anti-slavery. The Times was impartial and measured judgment. It avoided the advancement of any party, sect or person. As Ted Widmer, a New York Times blogger, wrote in March 2011, slave power was the aggressor against the original American idea, and that would never be able to depart the Union without military consequences. The Times published a letter from Patrick Henry Jr. thanking John Alsop for a book against slave trade entitled. In this letter, Henry honours Quakers for abolishing slavery, yet is disgusted by feeble Christian attempts to make a difference when slavery goes against everything Christianity preaches. The New York Herald was founded by James Gordon Bennett, Sir, in 1835. Bennett was of Scottish Catholic descent. The paper he produced was called Spiciest Paper in America, laced with sex, scandal, and James Gordon Bennett's erratic opinions by John War in re-electing Lincoln. It thrived on sensationalism, yet was said to give the most copious, if not the most accurate, news of any American journal, according to English journalist Edward Dickey, who visited America in 1861. The Herald took an anti-war stance, yet was tolerant of slavery. It made readers aware that slavery isn't only happening in the South, but points fingers to Northerners as well in a brief about the slave trade activity, almost to say, why are we fighting the war when we're just as guilty? At one point in the beginning of the 1860 political campaign, Bennett called Lincoln an uneducated man, a rabid abolitionist without courage. The Scottish and Irish didn't want to fight a war for black people's rights. Currently, they were above black people in societal rank, and they didn't want to jeopardize their position. The New York Tribune was founded by Horace Greeley in 1841. The paper made it a part of his lifelong campaign to improve the moral character of the nation and alleviate the suffering of the poor, according to PBS.com. It was straightforward and conservative and provided a no-nonsense approach compared to the sensationalism of Herald. The paper published stories with a strong moralistic flavour. The Tribune's stance on the war was that slavery should be outlawed, but African Americans shouldn't have the same rights and privileges as white men.
The Liberator was founded by William Lloyd Garrison in 1831. Garrison was an abolitionist since age 25 and a leader of the emerging anti-slavery movement, according to ushistory.gov. He refused compromise and relied on moral persuasion, telling his audience the horrors of slavery. He disdained politics because he viewed the political world as one of compromise. Before the Civil War even began, Garrison publicly burned a copy of the Constitution because it permitted slavery. The paper owed much of its success to the 75% of readers who were free African Americans. The Charleston Mercury was owned by Robert Barnwell Wright at the time of the Civil War. The paper was incredibly in favor of slavery since it was distributed from the city where the first shots of the war were fired. An extra published by the Mercury from December 20th, 1860 bore the title, "The Union is Dissolved." It declared South Carolina's decision to secede from the Union. A few years later, the paper was just as strong in its stance on the war. An editorial against black Confederate troops published on January 13, 1865 stated, "South Carolina will stand to the bitter end of destruction." The editorial went on to say, "We are free men, and we choose to fight for ourselves. We want no slaves to fight for us." They claimed they didn't need the slaves, yet wouldn't compromise upon emancipation. While the North and South seemed to be split in their stances, the black presses, which seemed to be led by Frederick Douglass, spoke of one idea: freedom. The North Star was founded by Frederick Douglass in 1847. The title came about because slaves escaping the night followed the North Star in the sky to freedom. The ideas instilled by the publication were to abolish slavery in all its forms and aspects, promote the moral and intellectual improvement of the colored people, and hasten the day of freedom to the 3 millions of our enslaved fellow Americans.
Frederick Douglass is mostly known for being an anti-slavery abolitionist activist, as well as a dominant role in the early ages of mass communications. Douglass was the son of a black slave mother and a white father who was most likely the owner of both him and his mother. At age 10, he was sent away from his home and his mother to another slave owner in Maryland who was a shipbuilder. And when he spent his time in Baltimore, his slave owner was very good to him and taught him to read, taught him to write. And during his time there, he read the Columbian Orator, which is a pro-African American, pro-abolitionist newspaper, and it really shaped a lot of his views and kind of set the course for the rest of his life as an activist. After a short time there in Baltimore, he was sent away to a new slave owner, Edward Covey, who was known as the slave breaker for his harsh and cruel treatment of his slaves. Edward Covey was quoted as saying, "Douglass was too defiant and would probably be dead by the end of the year," because he always would fight back against his master Edward. Douglass tried to escape 2 times while under Edward's rule, and on the 3rd time, his final attempt to escape, he made it to New York with the aid of a woman named Anne Murray, who ended up to be his future wife. When he reached New York, he then changed his name to what we know now as Frederick Douglass, and he began to attend lots of abolitionist conventions and speakers, and he wanted to become involved in this movement because he felt very passionately about it. He started to speak at some of these events, and people realized that he had great potential as a public speaker, so they recruited him to continue, and he did. This is a quote from PBS.org. "Douglass began to travel widely as a spokesman for the abolitionist cause. With his towering posture, rich baritone voice, and forceful command of the English language, the orator, only 20 years old at the time, vividly describes the horrors of slavery to audiences throughout the free states in Europe." During his time as an orator, he also started to write a book. It was titled "A Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave." It was an extremely influential literary piece. It uncovered the secrets and horrors of slavery. Many did not think a black slave had the potential to write such intricate and forceful writings. But his use of dates, names, in his book increased his credibility. He also had 2 white people sign off and say that this was a true autobiography. And because of this, it became a bestseller and a very influential piece in the abolitionist movement. He also was the editor of the North Star newspaper. And here's a quote from it. "The thing worse than rebellion is the thing that causes rebellion." This was in regards to slavery, of course. And the North Star was basically just a newspaper that was spun everything in an abolitionist propaganda style, I guess. After seeing his life's work vindicated by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to the Constitution, Douglas held various government posts and continued to labor throughout the Reconstruction period for civil rights of black Americans, women, anyone who was a minority and was put down. Here are some of the accomplishments of Frederick Douglass. He created the first integrated school system with blacks and whites attending. He gained entrance to the White House, or the first African American to gain entrance to the White House with Abraham Lincoln. Appointed to a federal office, that of federal marshal in Washington, D.C. First black American offered press credentials to the Gallery Pass in the U.S. Senate in 1870 through 1874. Was the first black man to run as vice president in 1872, though he was unsuccessful. First black man to be a foreign ambassador. He was an ambassador to Haiti. And upon his death in February 20th, 1895, he was the first African American to lie in state at the Capitol Rotunda.
The Civil War era was a time period when communication was at its absolute slowest. Samuel Morse, James Bennett, and Julia Ho, however, seemed to outsmart society to discover new ways to promote and express their ideas. These three came up with inventions that changed communications for a lifetime. Samuel Morse was a brilliant man born in Charleston, Massachusetts on April 27, 1791. He attended Yale, and he realized his real interest lied in art. However, his father believed that being an artist was not a suitable occupation for a man. Later on in Morse's lifetime, he decided to combine his artistic scientific talents to invent the Morse code. Morse created the idea of the single-circuit electromagnetic telegraph while on a ship traveling back from the United States from Europe in 1832. He then spent the next 5 years developing his ideas into a working model. His ideas consisted of the use of the code of dots and dashes for letters in the alphabet. The dots and dashes were transmitted as short, long electrical impulses with gaps in between them. To promote his new invention, he began to demonstrate the Morse code to businessmen in hopes that private investors would finance construction of a telegraph line. However, slow communication during this time was a setback for Morse. For example, in 1825, Morse was 500 kilometers away when his young wife died suddenly. He was unable to attend her funeral because it took a week for the news to reach him by mail. However, if Morse code was invented at an earlier date, the electric impulse could travel instantly and eliminate slow communication. James Bennett was born in Newmill, Scotland, on September 1st, 1795. Bennett went to the United States, where he worked as a translator for the New York Courier. Twice Bennett tried to launch papers of his own, but each time his papers failed due to lack of political support. In 1835, at the age of 40, Bennett launched the New York Herald, which made him famous. By 5 each morning, he was at his desk, ready to go for the news of the day. He initiated daily Wall Street reports, sent small boats out to intercept ocean-going vessels for news, initiated the society page, and was the first to use the telegraph extensively for news coverage. He insisted that advertisers change their ads frequently, a policy that skyrocketed consumer sales and caused merchants seeking similar results to flock to the Herald. Julia Ward Hose was born in New York City in 1819. At the age of 21, Julia married Samuel Ho. Samuel admired her ideas, her quick mind, and her active commitments, but he believed that a married woman should not have a life outside the home. He thought that women should support their husbands and not speak publicly or be active. However, her bitterness made her, despite his opposition, to get more involved in writing and public life. She believed in personal beliefs, loving God who cared about the affairs of humanity, and she believed in a Christ who taught a way of acting, a pattern of behavior that humans should follow. In the aftermath of the Civil War, she began to see struggles between legal rights for blacks and the need for equality of women. She became active in the movement to gain the vote for women. By 1869, Julia helped to found the American Women's Suffrage Association. At this time, the suffrages split into two camps, over blacks versus women's suffrage, and over state versus federal focus. She lectured and wrote frequently on the subject of women's suffrage. Julia's later years were marked when she continued to lecture widely, and many people came to see her because of her fame as the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Her themes usually were service over fashion and reform over frivolity. As hard as the Civil War era was, Samuel Morse, James Bennett, and Julia Ho seemed to outsmart society to discover new ways to promote and express their ideas, from Morse code to publishing a newspaper to simply standing up for one's beliefs, and through lecture. They changed society. James Gordon Bennett was born on September 1st, 1795. He was a very influential person during the Civil War era. He is a major figure in the history of American newspapers because he created the largest newspaper called the New York Herald. One thing that was unique about him and his newspaper was the fact that he was a very non-political person. In fact, he actually solved a lot of crimes, and he was very helpful with a lot of crime scene mysteries at the time. He didn't like church or government, and he kept them out of his paper. He believed that the newspaper should be a place for information to be given to the public without being skewed by the government or church's opinion. He became very rich from his newspaper, but it was not without hard work. He prided himself in having a very timely newspaper which relied on the Pony Express, a system he set up for faster delivery methods utilizing horses. At the time, many people still used carrier pigeons to transfer breaking news for long distances. During this time, there were people who would be paid to shoot these birds down from the sky just to withhold information. Samuel Morse was born in 1791, and he became a talented painter, which helped him with his design of the Morse code. He was well known for his portrait paintings. He eventually came up with the Morse code, which became a very powerful and important means for communication during the time of the Civil War. It made it possible to communicate over long distances. In 1825, the city of New York issued Morse $1,000 to paint a portrait in Washington. He left his home, and in the time that he was gone, his wife suddenly became very ill. He received a letter detailing the sudden failure of his wife's heart and rushed back home. By the time he got there, his wife had already been buried. He was heartbroken. For that days, he was unaware that his wife was even dying. After this incident, he veered away from painting and focused on long-distance communication. He eventually came up with the Morse code, which was used with the telegraph, which became a powerful and important means of communication during the Civil War. It made it possible to communicate over long distances. However, it did have drawbacks. All the enemy had to do was cut the wire, which inspired many more people to try and invent new forms of communication that were not so easily stopped. The code itself was a binary code, not mechanics. Samuel Morse inspired the computer to be created, which is why he is such an important historical figure. Julia Ward Howe was born in New York City on May 27th. She was a prominent American abolitionist, poet, and social activist. She was very influential during her time. She stands out greatly from the rest because she was the author of the Battle Hymn Republic. This was a book that really stirred things up. It was one of the first books that really pushed the limits and made people question the way things were rather than just accepting them. She was inspired to write this book after meeting Abraham Lincoln at the White House. The book Dixie, which came earlier, is sometimes compared to Howe's book. However, it was not as powerful. Howe published this book right around the time of the Gettysburg Address. After the war, Julia focused her efforts on women's suffrage. Thursday, November 19, 1863, in the middle of the American Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln gave one of the most famous speeches in history. The Gettysburg Address, as it became known, as it was given in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, almost 5 months after the Union had defeated the Confederacy during the Battle of Gettysburg. This speech helped to shape the war into a war for freedom and equality for everyone. During the ceremony at Gettysburg, there were 2 speakers. One was Edward Everett, who spoke for 2 hours, and the other speaker was President Lincoln, who only spoke for 2 minutes, but had such a strong point that his speech was more influential than Edward's. During Lincoln's address, he made suggestions to change the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. The reasons he wanted to make the changes were because he felt that Americans were one people and one country. In just 272 words, Lincoln helped to define the value and price for freedom of all Americans. One of the most popular lines from his speech defines that this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This famous quote is what helped to ensure the survival of democracy and to help both sides understand the price of war. He also wrote it to help people remember the Founding Fathers' vision so long ago. During his speech, he not only addressed the Americans, but any nation that is founded on the same principles could survive and questioned the survival of democracy. This was a big point because it gave everyone something to think about and helped to reunite the nation that was so divided by the Civil War. Not only did the Gettysburg Address help to address the American government and the war, but it also had other impacts on history by making the American population reflect on how they thought about other citizens. A quote from Lincoln at Gettysburg: "He does not try to present a theory, but to inspire a symbol." With his speech, not only did he change the war and what it stood for, but he also started an intellectual revolution.
The Civil War represented the dawning of a new era in war reporting. In part, this was made possible by the economic condition of newspaper and magazine publishing, particularly in the North. The climbing circulations and increase in advertising revenues of newspapers and magazines in major metropolitan areas meant more money could be spent on reporting and illustrating the Civil War. The Civil War marked the beginnings of visual war reporting. Artists roamed the front, sketching battle scenes, leaders and camp life. These drawings seem to appear instantaneously in the 1850s with the rise of a new type of publication, the Illustrated News Weekly. Communication was notably fast in these times, compared to previous years, due to the introduction of the telegraph. By the 1860s, there were two main news weeklies, Frank Leslie's Illustrated Newspaper and Harper's Weekly. Both of them were published in New York City. Harper's Magazine made its debut in June 1850, the brainchild of the prominent New York book publishing firm Harper & Brothers. Harper's Weekly carried extensive coverage of the American Civil War. Some of the most important articles and illustrations of the time came from Harper's. Harper's was one of the most widely read journals in the United States throughout the Civil War. During its most influential period, it was the forum of the political cartoonist Thomas Nast, as well as other artists such as Winslow Homer, Theodore R. Davis, Henry Mosler, and the brothers Alfred and William Ward. Nast was born on September 27, 1840, and was an editorial cartoonist/caricaturist. He was a true mass communications icon from the Reconstruction era of 1863 through to 1877. Born in Germany, Nast then moved to New York at the age of 6 when his father, who often held political convictions, left Europe for America as he was advised it was the proper place for a man so fond of free speech. Nast is considered to be the most powerful person in media of his day, according to his biographer Albert Bigelow Paine. Nast was involved in the election of 8 American presidents and was considered a president maker and campaign breaker. Nast was highly influential in his time and created this power through his cartoons. Nast was illiterate, but his cartoons empowered people. His illustrations were potent and effective because not everyone could read the newspapers, but most could understand a picture. These cartoons were published in Harper's Weekly from 1862. An extremely popular cartoon of his titled Compromise with the South from 1864 had such a startling success. An increased edition of the weekly was printed to supply the demand, which millions of copies were circulated. This image was directed against those in North America who opposed the prosecution of the American Civil War. The cartoon shows that the war was a failure. Nast's relationship with Horace Greeley is one of importance. Nast detested Greeley and continuously drew destructive and comical caricatures of him. Thomas Nast and Harper's Weekly supported Abraham Lincoln and were in competition with the New York Tribune. Horace Greeley, editor of the New York Tribune, also supported Lincoln, but grew impatient with his seeming reluctance to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. In 1862, Greeley published an open letter to Lincoln in the New York Tribune, headlined "The Prayer of 20 Millions." In this letter, he urged Lincoln to take action and proclaim Southern slaves free. Harper's Weekly ridiculed Greeley for being so presumptuous to imply that he could speak for the citizens of the North by publishing Nast's negative caricatures mocking him. Lincoln did, however, respond and announce the Emancipation Proclamation just 1 month after Greeley's letter was published. Nast was hired to be the campaign manager for 18th U.S. President, head of Republican Party, Ulysses S. Grant, from 1872. Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, switched from supporting the Republicans to supporting the Democrats, making Nast and Greeley competitors. Greeley died after this election due to health issues. However, it was often humorously suggested that Nast killed him with his cartoons, referring to how Nast killed Greeley's public image. Around this time was when Nast invented the elephant symbol for the Republicans. Harper's Weekly was known for its long battle with Tammany Hall. In the early 1870s, after the Orange Riots by the Irish labourers, Harper's Weekly, using Nast as their weapon, began a campaign. Tweed had led a group of corrupt politicians who gained power in the Democratic Party in 1863, when Tweed was elected leader of Tammany Hall. With the help of the New York Times, Harper's Weekly and Nast exposed Tweed and brought him down. Harper's Weekly was considered the only magazine to commit itself fully to the fight against New York City's Tweed Ring. Nast depicted Tweed as a thief in his cartoons, and these were published in Harper's Weekly month after month. For Nast, Tweed personified two great evils afflicting American society after the Civil War. On the one hand, corruption and greed, and on the other, the influence of Irish immigrants. In addition to his caricatures of Boss Tweed, Nast also created the Tammany Tiger as a symbol for the Tweed Ring. Tweed retaliated by removing Harper's Brothers school books from the public schools. Although the Harper's Company suffered a severe financial loss, it did not back down. Nast continued to draw his cartoons and even illustrated Tweed ripping Harper's books from the hands of school children. Although Nast and Harper's Weekly were successful in creating a negative image of Tweed, they could not actually break up the Tammany Hall gang and bring Tweed down. However, disgruntled insiders began to leak the details of the extent and scope of the Tweed Ring's greed to the newspapers. The New York Times then published evidence of Tweed's corruption. This gave prosecutors the proof needed to convict him. A key point in the Reconstruction era is the 1867 election, whereby Thomas Nast and Harper's Weekly played an important role in tipping the presidential election and inadvertently causing the Jim Crow era. The 1876 election is considered one of the most controversial presidential elections in American history. Rutherford Hayes, representing the Republicans, ran against Samuel Tilden for the Democrats. After the first count of votes, there were 20 votes unresolved. These 20 electoral votes were in dispute in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina and Oregon. The election was so close that recounts were ordered. The Democrats tried to bribe the Electoral Commission. At this point in the time, the Union Army had been sent into the South to maintain law and order and reconstruct society with no slavery. The South was resentful and wanted things to go back to the way they were. The South supported slavery and did not support the Reconstruction. The Democrats were predominant in the South, so Nast was worried that if the Democrats won the election, then slavery would be brought back, as well as the potential for another war. Knowing how powerful his political cartoons were as president makers and campaign breakers, Nast used his talent, with Harper's publishing his cartoons, to expose the Democrats in a bid to help the Republicans gain power. The Democrats made a deal to award all 20 electoral votes to Hayes and ultimately give up the presidency to the Republicans, in agreement that the Republicans withdraw federal troops from the South, ending Reconstruction and causing a North-South separation. This resulted in slavery not being reinstituted, but this is when the Jim Crow era, a return racial violence in the South, occurs, whereby many laws are passed in support of separation. This was obviously not Thomas Nast or Harper's Weekly's intention, but it was a result of their actions. Thomas Nast died on December the 7th, 1902, after catching yellow fever during its outbreak. Harper's Weekly ended in 1916, but Harper's is still publishing today. Description of picture. As shown in this Thomas Nast cartoon, Worse Than Slavery, white groups such as the Ku Klux Klan and the White League used every form of terror, violence and intimidation to restore a white man's government and redeem the noble lost cause. Main newspapers of the slavery era were the Liberator, the Charleston Mercury, the North Star, the New York Times, the New York Herald, and the New York Times Tribune.
In conclusion of the Civil War era, James Gordon Bennett was a very influential person who created the New York Herald newspaper. Samuel Morse created the Morse Code after he was born in 1971. And Julia Ward Howe wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, which was a very influential book of that time.
In summary of the Gettysburg Address, the speech helped to shape the war into a war for freedom and equality for everyone. In just 272 words, Lincoln helped to define the value and price of freedom for all Americans. One of the most popular lines from the speech defines that this is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Thomas Nast's potent political cartoons changed American history in the Reconstruction era. Using Harper's Weekly as his medium, together they were successful in bringing down the corrupt William Boss Tweed and the Tammany Ring. They also played a large part in the election of 8 American presidents, including Rutherford Hayes in the infamous 1876 election, and inadvertently causing the Jim Crow era, a return of racial violence in the South.